Hi there! Welcome to Joyful Stories. It's a great day to read a chapter book together. Are you ready? Awesome! Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe! Today, we are going to read the book, Here Comes Trouble. Are you ready? Let's begin! Chapter 1. On Friday afternoon, Class 7 had an art lesson. It was their favorite lesson of the week. Everyone looked forward to it. Everyone except Trudy Hubble. Trudy had elbows that stuck out and knocked things over. Her hands were large and clumsy. Her feet were so big, she was always tripping over things. When she came into the classroom, Rob Mason said, "Look out! Here comes trouble!" This was Rob's idea of a joke. He called her Trouble because it sounded like her two names, Trudy Hubble, put together. The other kids laughed. Trudy had to smile and pretend she didn't mind. But she did mind. She minded a lot. Mrs. Weston said, "Sit down, Trudy. Let Lisa bring you a water jar and some paints. And don't move out of your seat unless you must." Trudy knew why Mrs. Weston wanted her to sit down. Mrs. Weston had been her teacher for 3 months now. She had seen what happened when Trudy tried to do art. It was always a disaster. Lisa Gibbs fetched paper and paint and brushes. She put them on the table she shared with Trudy. Next, she filled a jar with water and took that to Trudy. Before she sat down, she moved her chair as far away from Trudy as possible. Trudy wished she could be more like Lisa. Lisa never knocked things over. She had small hands and feet and wavy brown hair. Trudy's hair was as straight as straw. "Now today," Mrs. Weston said, "I'd like you to paint me a monster, the scariest monster you can think of." "Oh, great!" Class 7 loved painting monsters. Trudy decided to start with the eyes. The eyes were the scariest part of any monster. She dipped her brush in red paint. Then she made 2 large red circles on the paper. Then 2 large yellow circles. Then 2 large green circles. But it didn't look much like a monster. It looked more like 2 sets of traffic lights. She glanced at Lisa's picture. Lisa had painted a beautiful green dragon with flames coming out of its mouth. Trudy sighed. She reached out to dip her brush in some black paint, and, oh no! She knocked over the jam jar. Dirty water spread in a pool across the table. It drowned Lisa's dragon. "Oops, sorry," Trudy muttered. Lisa stared down at her soggy picture. Tears came into her eyes. Rob Mason came over to look. "Hey, Mrs. Weston," he called. "Come and see what Trudy's done now." Trudy went red in the face. "I'll get a cloth," she muttered. She jumped to her feet and, crash! Her chair fell over backwards. She turned round and her paintbrush caught Rob Mason across the face. It gave him a droopy black mustache. He was so surprised that he staggered back against a wire bookstand. The bookstand came crashing down, and books went all over the floor. "Oh, no!" Mrs. Weston came hurrying over. She caught her leg on Trudy's chair and laddered her tights. Disaster. Chapter 2. "I hate art," Trudy thought as she went home on the bus. "And I hate school." She wished she never had to go to school again. The bus stopped outside her house. She jumped up from her seat. Her elbow knocked a woman's hat right over her eyes. Oops, sorry. She got off the bus and ran indoors. As soon as she opened the door, she knew something was wrong. The house was too quiet. Not a sound from the kitchen. Not a sound in the hall. Mom? She called. Mom, where are you? I'm upstairs, Trudy. Mom's voice sounded strange, all hoarse and croaky. Trudy went upstairs 2 at a time. She opened the bedroom door. Mom lay in bed, holding a box of paper hankies. I've got an awful cold, she said. Don't come too close, or you might catch it. Okay. Trudy stayed near the door. Shall I make you a mug of tea? Mom said quickly. No, thanks. I'll wait till your dad gets home. Trudy sighed. She knew why Mom didn't want her to make any tea. She was afraid Trudy would spill it coming up the stairs. But there is something I'd like you to do. What's that? Trudy asked eagerly. Take a message to Mrs. Willow. Tell her I shan't be well enough to come to work tomorrow. Mom blew her nose into a paper hanky. She's a very old lady. I don't want to give her my cold. I'll go straight away. Trudy turned to the door. Thanks. Oh, but Trudy... Trudy stopped. Yes, Mom? Mrs. Willow's house is full of beautiful things. I have to be very, very careful not to break anything. So if she asks you to come in, you'd better say no. Trudy sighed. Yes, Mom. She went downstairs again and ran along the crowded street. Oops, sorry, she said as she bumped into a passerby. Luckily, she didn't have far to go. Mrs. Willow lived in a tall, graceful old house. Trudy knocked on the door and waited. She heard the tap-tap of a stick coming from inside. The door opened. There stood an old lady with white hair and sharp blue eyes. Although she walked with a stick, she was tall and graceful, like her house. Hello, Mrs. Willow, said Trudy. I'm Trudy Hubble. My mom's your home help. She won't be able to come tomorrow. She's got a cold. I'm sorry to hear that. What she needs is my special cold cure. Come inside and I'll give you some. Mrs. Willow opened the door wider. Trudy remembered her mother's warning. I'll wait here, she said. Nonsense. You can wait in my sitting room. Mrs. Willow turned and started to walk down the hall, her stick tap-tapping on the floor. Oh, help, thought Trudy. What should she do? Come in, called Mrs. Willow. Trudy took a deep breath and stepped inside. Chapter 3. Trudy looked around Mrs. Willow's sitting room. She saw at once why Mom had been worried. There were beautiful things everywhere. Pretty china figures and little glass animals, delicate tea sets and glass bowls. But the most beautiful thing of all stood alone on a little table. It was a large green and white vase with dragon painted on the side. Trudy stood very, very still. She was afraid to move in case she knocked something over. Stiff as a statue, she kept her elbows pressed to her sides. Mrs. Willow came back into the room. Ah, I see you're looking at my Chinese vase, she said. It's very, very old. Do you like it? Trudy nodded. Mrs. Willow held out a small brown bottle. Here's my cold cure, she said. Don't ask me what's in it. It's an old family secret, but it always works. Trudy took the bottle. She couldn't speak because she was holding her breath. Mrs. Willow looked hard at her. Is something wrong? Trudy shook her head. But you've gone quite red in the face. Are you sure you're all right? Trudy could hold her breath no longer. She let it out in a long, long sigh. I'm fine, she said. Thanks for the cold cure, Mrs. Willow. I must go home now. Mrs. Willow looked sad. Can't you stay for a cup of tea? No, I have to go. Trudy couldn't wait to get away. The room was too full of beautiful things. Any minute now there would be a disaster, she felt sure. She turned to the door. Something furry brushed against her leg. Trudy jumped backwards. The furry thing gave a loud yow. It leaped onto the piano. Trudy jumped again, sideways. Her elbow hit the green and white vase. It began to sway. She watched in horror as it rocked from side to side, to side to side, to side to side, and crash! It fell to the floor and broke into little pieces. Disaster! Nobody moved. The cat, who had caused all the trouble, sat on top of the piano. It swished its tail. Then Trudy said, Oh, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. It's because I'm clumsy. That's why I didn't want to come into your house. I knew something would get broken. It always does when I'm around. It's all right, Mrs. Willow said calmly. It doesn't matter. Surprised, Trudy stared at her. Doesn't matter? Not a bit. You see, that vase has been broken before. It had to be mended then. And do you know who broke it? Mrs. Willow smiled. I did, when I was just about your age. Yes, I used to be clumsy too. Trudy couldn't believe it. Mrs. Willow seemed so tall and graceful. She didn't look the sort of person who would knock things over. You couldn't have been as clumsy as I am, she said. I'm the clumsiest person in our school. Mrs. Willow took a photo from the top of the piano. Do you see this girl playing tennis? She asked. Well, that was me. Trudy looked at the photo. The girl playing tennis was tall and thin, with untidy hair. She had a wide grin on her face. Mrs. Willow laughed. I was a real ugly duckling, wasn't I? But do you remember what happened to the ugly duckling? Trudy nodded. It grew up to be a swan, but I don't think I shall. I'll just grow up to be an ugly duck. Not if you do as I did. You have to keep telling yourself that inside, where it matters, you're really a swan. Go on, say it now. Trudy said doubtfully, I'm a swan. It does work, you know. It's a kind of magic. Say it again, this time as if you really believe it. Trudy cleared her throat. She said it louder. I'm a swan. That's better. Mrs. Willow smiled. Now help me clear up these bits of old vase, then we'll have some tea. They drank tea from china cups. They ate chocolate cake off delicate plates. And Trudy didn't break another thing. She ran home muttering, I'm a swan. I'm a swan. And she didn't bump into a single person. So perhaps it was kind of magic after all. But what would happen tomorrow when she went to school? Chapter 4. Next morning, Mom's cold was much better. That's because of Mrs. Willow's secret family cure, Trudy said. It tastes horrible, said Mom, but it seems to work. Trudy was glad the cold cure had worked. It proved that Mrs. Willow knew what she was talking about, and if the cold cure worked, then the swan cure might work as well. She couldn't wait to try it out. On the way to school, she tried thinking herself a swan. She glided on the bus and sat down slowly. She didn't trip over anyone's feet. She didn't knock anyone's hat off. When the bus stopped, she rose slowly from her seat. She stepped onto the pavement. It was surprising how different she felt, so tall and graceful. In the school playground, some children stood looking up into the chestnut tree. "Look out, here comes trouble," called Rob Mason when he saw her. Trudy pretended not to hear him. She saw that Lisa Gibbs was in tears. "What's the matter?" she asked. "It's Lisa's kite," said Rob. "It got stuck up the tree." "Rob did it," Lisa said, wiping her eyes. "He let go and flew up into the tree." Rob looked a bit ashamed of himself. "Stupid old kite," he muttered. "It's a beautiful kite," said Lisa. "I got it for my birthday. It was my best present." She began to sob again. "Don't cry," Trudy said kindly. "I'll get it down for you. I'm good at climbing trees." Lisa looked horrified. "No, you'll tear it. It's only made of paper. Can't somebody else get it down?" But nobody else wanted to climb the tree. Trudy jumped up and grabbed the lowest branch. She swung herself up and began to climb. "Be careful," called Lisa. "It's a special Chinese kite. It cost a lot of money." Like the vase, Trudy thought, and nearly stopped. But then she thought of Mrs. Willow. "I'm a swan. I'm a swan," she muttered. And she started climbing again. She climbed higher and higher until she reached the kite. The kite was caught on a sharp twig. It was made of thin, silky paper and had a green dragon painted on it. "Don't rush," she told herself. "Swans never rush." At last she managed to free the kite, but now she had to climb down again, using only one hand. It took her ages, but she didn't rush. She saw that Mrs. Weston had joined the crowd below, but she still didn't rush. Very, very carefully, she swung herself down to the ground. The kite was safe. "Thanks, Trudy." Lisa showed it to the others. "Look, it's all right. She didn't tear it after all." Trudy felt very, very proud. But then Mrs. Weston said, "Trudy Hubble, what a mess you look. Your hands and knees are filthy. Go and wash them at once." For a moment, Trudy felt like her old clumsy self. But then she remembered what Mrs. Willows had said. It didn't matter how she looked outside. Inside, she was really a swan. Trudy smiled at Mrs. Weston. Then she glided swan-like across the playground and into school. The end. Hi kids, my name is Cookie Cow. See you next time. Bye.